So let's start with a quick recap of where we've been. So far we've had 2 weeks of stories that are mostly about showing God's power. So in chapter 1, we had God rewarding Daniel and his friends for their religious faithfulness by giving them strength and knowledge to impress his new bosses after they are brought into captivity in Babylon. And so then Daniel and his friends get to work in the court of the king. And then last week in chapter 2, we had Daniel receiving information from God that would normally be impossible for a human to gain alone, because King Nebuchadnezzar demanded not only that his dream be interpreted, but that the actual content of the dream be shared with him so that he could verify that the person speaking was truly a person of some kind of special power. But Daniel tells the king, no, it's not me that has any special power. It's God that has those special powers. So major themes that we've encountered so far is the radical idea that God is present outside of the traditional locations and how we understand God to be present. God is present and active in a foreign land, and even in the lives of foreigners themselves. So God is able to, I don't want to use the word manipulate necessarily, but kind of guide the decision making of even the people who are in the Babylonian court on behalf of God's people. Another theme is God's sovereignty over that of earthly kings. All earthly kings and kingdoms pass away, but God's reign is eternal and God's power is ultimate, unlike these other kings. And then a theme of hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. We've got major theological crises of the loss of 2 of the most prominent covenants that God made with the people of Israel. The Abrahamic covenant, when God made the covenant with Abraham that the people of Israel would dwell in the promised land, the land of flowing with milk and honey. They have been removed from that place and taken into exile in Babylon. And then also the loss of the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David, that his kingdom would reign forever. And given that the descendants of David are now murdered and the last king is enslaved, it seems like that covenant is gone as well. So trying to figure out how to deal with those things. And then last week, we kind of were introduced a little bit to the apocalyptic elements of the book of Daniel with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the temptation. We are tempted in reading things like that to read them as glimpses of some kind of unknown future. The description of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt about, and what do the different elements refer to as future events, and how are we to understand this? And I don't know that there's anything necessarily wrong with doing that. It's hard to be sure what it is you're talking about, because like I mentioned last week, depending on who you are in history and where you sit, you can decide that the different body parts that it describes are the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire or the Eastern Orthodox Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, or the Nazis, or anything. You can read it into to make it fit your own time and place. But I think the main purpose we have to remember, even if we're interested in doing some of that kind of looking about what future events it might refer to, the main purpose is to bring hope in the here and now to whoever it is that's reading it, whether the person who's reading it is someone who lived at the time that it was written, or at the time that story was told, even before it was written down, or who lives now. So that's kind of where we are with our lessons. So let's now jump into chapter 3, and as we've been doing, I will ask for a couple of people who might be willing to do some reading. This chapter has 30 verses, so if we have somebody who wants to read all of them, great. If not, we can kind of split it into 2 readings, I think. Do we have a volunteer?
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful.
This is Karen. So I'll start off on chapter 3.
Yep, chapter 3, verse 1. And if you want to read until you get tired, then we can find somebody else.
I'll read through 5. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up."
Okay. Who'd like to read next?
Well, I could go on till 7.
Oh, okay.
That'll finish that section. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up.
Okay. Thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Okay, I'll start it then.
All right, thank you.
At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have," I just lost my place here. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was very furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisor, "Weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see four men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like the son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses turned into pillars of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king prompted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
All
Here
right.
endeth the reading.
Thank you. Okay, so what's going on here? What is of interest to you in this reading?
I have to think about it for a minute. Well, I can't imagine what kind of faithfulness it takes to, go against a king like that, knowing you're going to get thrown into a fire. I mean, that's a lot of trust and faith,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know that
think-
it's a trust. It's a trust in the king. Did you say it's trust in the king?
No,
Trusting God.
Trust in
trust
God.
in God.
Yeah. Yeah, they're God.
And
For
I
some
really,
reason,
I really
Go ahead.
like the king's change of mind. That he recognized their faith and so strongly, and realized that they weren't burned, and that was a miracle by their God. And it's I guess he didn't say that he gave up his gods, but he certainly believed in their God, our God, after that demonstration. And it goes further into the next chapter too, with Daniel and his interpretations. But
Seemed like this
Nebuchadnezzar
was
comes around.
a very violent time. I mean, he was going to throw them in the fire, and then if you don't believe in their God because their God saved them, then he's going to kill them, the ones that don't believe.
Jesus.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
kill, kill, kill.
yeah, Nebuchadnezzar
mutilate.
is definitely portrayed as a very volatile figure here.
Violent.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Big ego.
let's look at
Yes.
some of those verses kind of in the middle where the friends are before Nebuchadnezzar, because I think there's some important and interesting things going on there. The first one is, notice how it is that Nebuchadnezzar even found out about what was happening with these three guys. That he says that they need to do this bowing down to this statue anytime there's music. It's almost like musical chairs. You hear the music and it's time to bow down, instead of you hear the music stopping, it's time to sit down. And so how is it that he even finds out about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not listening to his decree?
Astrologers rat them out.
Yeah. So this is this word that's translated astrologers in some translations, or Chaldeans in other places. This is the same people who in chapter 2 were the ones who were called to the king to interpret his dream and could not do it. And then Daniel was able to do it. So
That makes sense.
yeah.
It's revenge.
Yeah. So there's a possibility that, you know, and we talked earlier about whether or not these stories are back-to-back events, or if they are different stories coming out of kind of a vaguely folkloric past. But in terms of the person, at least, who put Daniel as we see it today together, I would say that there's a pretty strong case that they're trying to say that this was an act of revenge by those people who were made to look bad in chapter 2 because they were unable to help the king, and then Daniel was able to. And so perhaps they are trying to reclaim their dominance by saying, hey, remember those guys that you liked so much because they helped you out with your dream? Well, now they won't bow down to your statue, so maybe you don't like them quite as much as you thought you did. And the funny thing is that Nebuchadnezzar buys it, right? He flies into a furious rage and demands that they come before him immediately, because how dare they not listen to my decree? And then I think some of the other points.
How come there's an absence of Daniel in this whole story?
Yes, Daniel does not appear, which is interesting. He is not part of this. He's not part of this whole debacle. But the friends do, when they're in front of the king, kind of make a point that I think kind of Rich and Karen were going back and forth about. They say in my version, verse chapter 16, they say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace, let him deliver us, but if not, then we will not serve your gods anyway." So they don't even make a defense of themselves. They say, hey, you know, the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter what we say because we're not going to do what you say, but our God, we know that our God has the power to protect us, and so we're gonna be faithful to that and have that kind of courageous faith. There's no comeback for them to give, and because of course later we find that the comeback is God's to give, and God's alone.
Katie, I have a question. Some stuff that I was reading last night about this chapter calls the three friends of Daniel children. Were they very young? Do you know?
No, they would have been.
They were men.
Yeah, they would have been. If depending on the timing. They definitely would have been at least young men, if not older men, depending on what we understand the difference between chapter 1 and chapter 3 to be in terms of any timeline. But certainly they would not have been completely children.
Yeah, they were probably talking about children of God or something.
Yeah, possibly.
And I didn't understand. Yeah, but they were young men, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder, how did they describe them when they rat them out? There are certain
They
Jews
just say
whom you have
friends of
appointed
Daniel.
over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So likely at least some time has passed since they were trained, because you would imagine it would take them at least a little bit of time to go from being trainees to having that kind of that power over the affairs of the province of Babylon, which is the main, that would be like giving somebody the DC Circuit Court before he has ever been a judge in any other capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they had to learn the new language and everything. And so I think it was, if I remember correctly, 3 years or
Yeah,
so.
I think that's what it said in chapter 1.
Yeah.
They were to be trained for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been around for a little while. So even if they were kind of older teenagers when they started, they'd by now be young men.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
What else do we see? Maybe a little bit further down, we can get into the furnace itself. What sticks out to you there?
Yeah, I'm looking at it, that Nebuchadnezzar asks for the furnace to be heated 7 times more than usual, and that the men who took Meshach and the others to the furnace died because of the heat from the furnace. That's cruel. That's something. Hot, yes.
Yeah, so I see that as kind of a parallel to something that we saw last week when Nebuchadnezzar not only demanded that his advisors interpret his dream, but he wouldn't even tell them the dream. He wanted them to say what the content of the dream was. It's this, this overwrought, kind of ridiculous levels of almost parody levels of responses here.
Reaction.
Yeah. So it's not just that he wants them to be burned. It's that we've got to make it 7 times hotter. It's so hot that the people who got close enough to throw them in died because of the heat. And so it's that just extreme reaction, extreme instability of Nebuchadnezzar.
So then it's interesting that he completely reverses himself so quickly, I guess he's overwhelmed when they come out of the fire unharmed, and just awestruck because of the truth of that, because to be that violent and that powerful, and then to just change, God must have really spoken to Nebuchadnezzar also.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think he spoke to Nebuchadnezzar, or was Nebuchadnezzar just fearful of the God that saved the men?
Agreed. Yeah. Marge, did you have something on that?
Well, I would use the word fickle.
Fickle. Yeah.
I see it as it put the literal fear of God into him.
What's that, Marge?
Well, they used the numbers.
Yes, they did.
That's something that doesn't mean actually 7. Would you explain that?
Yeah, sorry. Steve, did you have something to toss into that?
Yeah, I think this is like where you get the term, put the fear of God into him. And literally, he reverses track, and then he's going to kill everybody, kill the other guys.
Yeah. So I think there are several things going on here. I think number one, we're trying to again create that caricature of King Nebuchadnezzar, that he swings so far in one direction, so far in another direction, because he's fickle, because he is volatile. You can't trust him. He does not have any control over his own emotions, let alone his kingdom. But then you also have the point about the supremacy of God, the power of God, the sovereignty of God. And so if there's a regular fire, then sure, that's one thing. But what if the fire is 7 times hotter? And so 7 doesn't necessarily mean a literal 7 times, but I think it's similar
Right.
to, if any of you are familiar with the story of Elijah and his competition with the priests of Baal. And so they have,
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
they're supposed to call on their God to light their altar on fire. And so all of these priests are, prostrating themselves and beating themselves and cutting themselves and doing all these things that they think that their God is going to respond to get their altar to light, and nothing happens. And then it's Elijah's turn. He gets up there to his altar. He douses it with water so that it's soaking wet. And, it's just this extreme, overwrought response, so that we know that it would be impossible for anything else to be the solution except for God's intervention. That it can't possibly be that this altar set on fire because of like a freak spark that happened, or Elijah, himself tricked everyone into thinking that God had done it, but really it was him, because he created circumstances in which it would be literally impossible under normal natural science for it to happen. And so I think that's kind of the point here too, that 7 times hotter might not necessarily mean literally 7 times hotter, but is referring to that same idea that it could not possibly be any hotter by natural means, and therefore anything in its path should be completely consumed. Someone certainly getting near it would die instantly, but look what happens instead. And so there's no other possible explanation than the intervention of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So I think that's going on simultaneously with the undermining of Nebuchadnezzar as a king who is in control of himself and of what it is that he's trying to do. What else do we see here?
Do you think that the soldiers that died were an example of how that make it real clear that fire was so hot that it should kill people?
Yeah, I think that was the point of the soldiers, was just to show that, you don't have to get in the fire for it to kill you, for it to be absolutely impossible for you to survive it. You just have to get near it. That's how ridiculous this is. And certainly the image of the fire, we've got the torn limb from limb and your house reduced to rubble punishment. But here, I think the fire is an interesting choice, because we've got this fiery rage coming from Nebuchadnezzar juxtaposed next to this literal fire that they're being thrown into. And so as Nebuchadnezzar gets angrier and angrier and angrier, the heat of his fire gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and starts to impact not just the people that he's trying to punish, but everybody else around him. And so I think there's something going on there too, potentially.
This is Karen again. Verse 25, in verse 24, verse 24, he says, didn't we put 3 men in the fire? And they all say yes. And he says, but I see 4 men walking in there without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like son of the gods. That's a great verse. I like that.
Yeah. So
I think. Sorry.
Nope. Go ahead, Louisa.
Well, just to think about God being with them, Jesus being with them during that time.
And I
the fact that they're walking.
Yeah, walking around.
They were bound. They were bound.
Yeah.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
What did you have, Louisa?
No, I was just going to say that the king seeing the Son of God with the three men was a powerful message, a very effective testimony of the power of God to Nebuchadnezzar. And in part, made him have the reaction at the end that he did to forgive the three men and everything else. And so I think not only the fire not burning the three men, them coming out unbound and unharmed, no smell of fire in their clothes or hair or anything. And plus the fourth man that he saw there, that was Jesus. And what else did he need to trust that God is all powerful and he's the only one that can do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I don't think Nebuchadnezzar believed in their God. He just was fearful of their God's power.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he believed in God. He just feared the power of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe eventually he will.
So, yeah, this phrase about a son of God or a son of the gods or something like that is an interesting phrase. It's not completely understood what it means, what it's trying to refer to when we're looking at it in the Old Testament. Certainly by this time in history, the idea of the Son of God being connected to the king or the emperor had started to become popular. So there's not any evidence of this in the book of Daniel in reference to Nebuchadnezzar himself, but especially by the time you get into the Greeks and the Romans, the king or the emperor is thought to be the son of God, and so understood
Right.
that this power is given by God, and so the calling Jesus the Son of God was not a theological statement; it was a political statement that Jesus is the Son of God, not Caesar. And so the same
Right.
kinds of ideas were floating around a little bit at this time. It wasn't quite as developed, but certainly that was at play. And then another thing that is at play is throughout the Old Testament, not too often, but there are certain times when we see that same phrase, the sons of God, sometimes in reference to potentially angels. We see it in the story of Noah, the sons of God in Genesis are living on earth, and so some people have this understanding of like giants that are somehow not human, but also not completely spiritual and not completely God, but also have some kind of physical manifestation. But this idea of the Son of God also, interestingly, is used to refer to the people of Israel as a whole. So the Son of God being the people, the children of God, is an easier way to understand it because it's more than one person. But the kind of this is weird, the personification of a people, the idea that a people could be expressed as one person, and that you can also see in some of the Isaiah's writings. The suffering servant is often understood to be, even though we're talking about one person who is the Son of God, it's actually referring to Israel as a whole. And so this concept that Israel is the Son of God, even though it's a whole nation of people, is potentially also at play here. So is this person an angel, or some kind of messenger from God? Is this person Jesus? Is this person kind of the embodiment of God himself in some other type of way? Is it some kind of representation of the entirety of the people of Israel? Is it another famous character from the Old Testament? Is it Elijah? Is it Abraham? Is it Jacob? We don't know who it is or what it is that we're trying to point to here. But I think the point is that God is present with them in this place, and not just in a kind of spiritual but distant way, but in a real, physical, meaningful way, that they are unbound, they are unharmed, they are somehow in the fire, not just protected, but also having some kind of additional experience of God that they are unable to, or have not had up to that point, outside of the fire.
Do the three men discuss who they were walking with later on in the book of Daniel?
Nope.
They never mention
never
it.
tell.
Okay. Wonder if they, I don't know, were they aware? They must have been aware of the presence of someone.
Yeah, we don't know. It's interesting that story doesn't tell us anything about how they respond to it. Once we get to that part of the story, and I'm looking just to verify, but it's all about Nebuchadnezzar. It's all about his response, and then the people who are looking on, the audience. It says saw that the fire had not done anything to them, and then Nebuchadnezzar blesses the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and makes this new decree, and then they're promoted again. And that's it. There's nothing about their experience. There's nothing about how they respond to any of this. And so I think that that's important to note, because you would think that if somebody's writing a story, what's the first question that people are going to have? Oh my gosh, what happened to them? How did they, what was that like to be in
What
there?
was the experience like?
But I think the author's trying to tell us that that's not the point. The point isn't about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The point is about Nebuchadnezzar. The point, once again, is going back to how this is expressing to Nebuchadnezzar that God has the sovereignty. God is in charge, not you. It doesn't matter what you do. You can make your fire as hot as it is humanly possible to make it, but I'm going to do what I want to do, and you can't stop me.
Yeah.
Well, I think Nebuchadnezzar is really no different than any of the other politicians before him or after him. They're kind of watching out for their own skin all the time, and they vacillate back and forth wherever the tide seems to take them. And I see him doing that here. It also says when they came out from the fire, the men came out. The fourth person did not come out, so we really don't know that much about him. And that's why I agree with Katie that this is really just a story built on blind faith, to show blind faith, which people should have, not totally, don't misunderstand, which should have a blind faith and not worry about the consequences. The three men were not worried about the consequences either way, as they felt probably that I'll worship my Lord today while I'm here, and if the fire consumes me, I'll worship the Lord while I'm standing in front of him. And that's kind of my take on this whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some thoughts from the group about that idea that, so if we accept that God's sovereignty exceeds that of any earthly political ruler, what are some ideas that you have about how that affects our priorities and the way that we make decisions in our lives? And I don't just mean, whether or not we throw ourselves into a fire.
Well, some people worshiping now in groups. There are churches that are still holding services. They're kind of walking in the fire. And trusting their faith that God will save them. And they're not, God gave us a brain and science and how to figure out different things. And I can't
Yeah.
imagine. I mean, they're walking in fire when they meet big groups of them.
Yeah, so you know, I saw on one of the news programs, I guess it was this past Sunday, they were interviewing people as they were driving into some megachurch parking lot, and the lady said, "I am covered in the blood of Christ. I am protected, so I'm not worried."
Yeah,
So what do we think about that? Do we think that that's
But
a
also,
faithful
you know,
response?
the Lord.
that's blind faith, but God didn't want us that blind to faith. He gave us the tools.
Hmm.
That's my opinion.
What do others think about that?
Or we don't kiss snakes at St. James.
Are you suggesting that you would like to institute that, Steve?
No.
Yeah, so I think it's a challenging question, and it's certainly not a new question. There in the early church, there were arguments about what it took to be a leader in the church, and for some people, they felt that in order to be somebody important, to show that you were worthy of some kind of elevated position, you had to be a martyr. You had to martyr yourself in some way. You had to have suffered. You have to have either died and then, be considered a kind of post-mortem leader, or you have to at least have been, beaten up by the government and treated poorly and had some kind of physical and emotional toll in order for you to prove that you were a true Christian. But others said, that's crazy. Why are we asking these people to waste their lives and die for no reason? There's a difference between standing up to the king and saying, no, I won't bow down to your statue, versus intentionally going out there and waving yourself in front of the government and saying, neener, 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 come and get me, come and get me. And so to try to navigate between those two things, I'm giving extreme examples on either end, but certainly you have to navigate that gray area in the middle. What is being faithful to God versus what is, as Jesus would have put it when he was tempted to throw himself off the temple by the devil, he said, "It is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." So where's the line between those two things? And different denominations and different individuals are going to come up with a different answer to those questions. Certainly, I mean, obviously, I'm married to the guy, so I agree with what Bob is doing and what the council at St. James is doing in terms of keeping us separated and making decisions that are going to keep as many of us safe as possible. But we would be accused by that woman of not being faithful and not believing that God can and will protect us from the coronavirus if we go out and put ourselves in that position because we want to go and gather for worship. So, what do we say to those people when they accuse us in that way?
Well, the point of staying at home is to protect yourself, but it's also to protect other people.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure that we have the right as Christians to completely disregard the people who are around us or who are most vulnerable in our society. That's not something that Jesus would have us do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we've been given these tools that we're using right now to stay in touch and to be involved in his work. And we're doing his work by staying at home and protecting other people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really
that's my idea.
Yeah.
I agree.
You listen to one of the ministers that I heard, and he was saying it's freedom of religion to continue to have his services. And I think he just really, I hope he doesn't lose his whole congregation over it.
Yeah.
Because if it goes in, it's gonna go rapidly.
Hmm.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's almost like
Yeah.
it's almost like it's baiting people to me, that we're saying, well, if you are afraid, if you won't come out to my service, then that means that you don't have enough faith. And so if you must do this thing, you must put yourself at risk, you must put others at risk, you must put the vulnerable people that you live with at risk, in order to prove to me and to the other people around you and to God that you have enough faith. I don't need to go anywhere for God to know what my faith is like. And I don't care what anybody else thinks of my faith, especially that guy.
No, I don't either. Especially that guy.
Sorry to get us off on a tangent here.
No, I think this is important.
No. But then what happens when those people start to die? Are they going to say, well, that one didn't have enough faith and that one didn't have enough faith? If they'd had enough faith, they'd still be alive.
It's like
they might even have funeral services at their church.
Yeah.
Put salt on that open wound. Let's rub it in.
It seems to me that along with faith comes wisdom.
And God gave us a brain.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Not just knowledge, but wisdom. And the churches meeting like that, to me, aren't executing much wisdom.
I don't know. It just seems so irresponsible to me, and I don't think that we're called to be that. I don't know. The other thing, that the thought that's come to me is that when I was diagnosed with cancer, and this has been 20 years ago, I had a meeting with Pastor Al where I was talking about it and what I was going to do and everything. And he said, and I've never forgotten it, he said, so that the idea is to be at peace no matter what the outcome. And so if I had been healed, which I was, then I was at peace. But if that wasn't to be, then I was at peace with that also. And I felt at peace through the whole time. And I think that maybe one of the messages from this chapter also is what you were saying earlier about they were at peace with whether they perished in the fire or survived.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a matter of faith; it's actually a matter of trust and peace.
Yeah, but then
if that makes any sense, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And then at the same time, combining that with this conversation that we've been having, using the tools that God gives us, that it's not having trust in God isn't just about sitting on your hands and saying, oh, well, God's going to save me from this fire, or God's going to cure me of this cancer, or God's going to protect me from this coronavirus when I go to my worship service. It's about having trust in God, regardless of the outcome, but also using the tools that God gives us, because those tools are gifts from God as well. That, I think people who refuse to use medicines because God will heal them are like Pat said, they're not being wise with their faith. That there's not a divide, a wall between faith and the tools that we have in our world. God has given us science, God has given us technology, and so if we don't use those, I think that is actually being unfaithful, because we're not doing everything we can to maintain and protect life in the way that God would want us to.
I know one of my first years of nursing, a woman came out of surgery. She had spontaneously aborted due to whatever reason and was hemorrhaging. And they took her to the OR to get the hemorrhaging stopped. And when they brought her out, they had blood hanging because her hemoglobin had dropped so low she was going to die. and they were Jehovah Witnesses,
Mm.
and they weren't supposed to give blood.
Yeah.
And the doctor looked at the husband and said, that was your child she was carrying, and you wanted her and the child to die because of blood. But he was livid, and I just could not accept that. His faith was such that he was gonna, if that was what needed to be, then let her die.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
not go there.
I
I
think
have
that's such
faith in
a,
God, but you
but
got
I
to
think,
use some common sense.
well, but I think that's such a limitation of how we understand how God works in the world. That in the Bible, we've got a lot of things that are, you know, from our reading, miracles, we can't explain them. But is it any less God's work when, you know, God gives us the knowledge to figure out how to extract blood and keep it safe and usable, and figure out what kind of blood goes into what kind of person so that it doesn't attack their body and hurt them, and all these kinds of technologies and science and understanding of how blood works? Isn't that process a gift from God in the same way that a miracle saving this woman without that intervention would have been? It's just that because we can
Yeah.
understand it, it's not magical. Miracles don't have to
Yeah.
be magical. Gifts from God don't have to be magic. And I think that's the thing that frustrates me with that kind of limitation
gift
of
of our-
how we understand how God works in the world.
The gift that he gives us is our knowledge and our ability to learn.
Could this discussion with congregations and whatnot a form of tempting God?
Mm,
Could be classified as that or not?
I think so. You know,
Yeah.
I think,
I dare you to.
yeah.
We're not supposed to
I
do
think
that.
that's you know, saying, well, I'm going to put myself out there so that God has an opportunity to show God's power in the world and prove all of you people wrong because I can go to church and not get sick. Mm,
Oh, geez.
Well, everybody remembers
Oh.
the old joke where the three men were in the boat and it was sinking, and they prayed to God to save them, and another boat came by and somebody offered them, you know,
Yeah.
the boat came, the plane came, everything came, and they refused to get on that because God was going to save them. And ultimately they die. And in the pearly gates, they said, well, why didn't you save me? And he said, no, look it. I sent you a boat. I sent you a life preserver. I sent you a plane. I sent you all these things. You chose not to use them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If we're
that-
choosing
that's-
not to use the science that's been given to us to help protect the people, then shame on us.
Hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm off on a tangent. Sorry.
No,
No,
Wow.
you're doing great.
what other questions or thoughts do we have about this here? We started a little late, but I don't want to take up too much of your time here.
I'm thinking about that pastor. That pastor is giving everybody one choice. You either worship at church or you don't. There's many choices. You can worship through Zoom. You can by reading the Bible. So he was giving them an either or, and that's never fair.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that even comes back to, I just keep thinking about the thing that Tim Carlisle said. Now it's going to have to be at least 3 or 4 weeks ago in class, that if anything seems like it's too simple, then it's probably not from God. If the answer is don't worship or come to my church, that's not a God option. God doesn't offer us an impossible choice between one thing or another thing. There's always a third door.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's very much like the the early Jews and Christians, and they were told by Paul and all the others that you don't have to go to Jerusalem to worship. You can set up different areas to worship God. And I think that's partially what we're seeing here. God is, through this, is giving us the opportunity to explore other areas. And I'm certain that many of the things we're doing here will continue on even after we get through this. At least I would like to see them, because it's a definite advantage to people that are living alone, like myself, and those with shut-ins. I really would like to see us continue this.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I think we got an email from the bishop the other day talking to us about the practice of communion, remote communion, and he said, "I cannot, in good conscience, promote a practice that is not part of our faith tradition and in our Lutheran confessions, but I will not discipline any pastors who discern together with their congregations that this is what they need to do." And I thought, to me, I feel like the way that we are led by God is by giving us opportunities to get out of our bubbles, and then it's our job to discern how we're going to fit that in, or whether what's going to be best moving forward. So it's not that everything that we've ever done in the past is always bad and everything that we do in the present or the future is always better. I think that's a false dichotomy. But I also think that it's important to say, so what have we gotten out of this? What's of value that we've done here, and how do we take what's of value from our quote unquote normal practices and try to integrate some of those things in. Certainly, I'm not at a place yet myself where I would say that the value of the true in-person, being able to touch another human being gathering is equal in value to this. I think that there, in some ways, this is inferior to that. But that doesn't mean that this doesn't have its other perks. We certainly wouldn't be able to have Ben in our Bible study if we were meeting at the church and doing it this way. And so how do we navigate the complexities of, kind of the pros and cons of what we've learned? I think is going to be something that's going to take us some time to work on and figure out how are we going to be church moving forward, given what we've experienced and the new things we've learned from it. And I think that that's part of the faithful response, and that's part of that growing of the wisdom that Pat was talking about, rather than just continuing on blindly with that blind faith of, well, now that God has taken away this impediment, then we'll go back to what we were doing before. Or now that God has taken away this impediment, it's clear that this is what we were supposed to be doing the whole time, and so let's keep doing it this way and close down all of our church buildings and just do it like this forever. I think both of those.
I think both are of value, and I don't think one needs to be more important than the other. I think they're both of value, and in different circumstances and in different times, or simultaneously, they can both be utilized. We're accomplishing God's work, in whether we're meeting in the church and worshiping there, whether we are having our individual ones here on the Zoom or YouTube, whatever we're on. They're both valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think maybe this is an opportunity to learn new things, not to cast out the old and traditional ways of doing things. I don't think we need to do that. But I do think that we need to be moving into the future and seeing what God has for us coming up,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is one answer, but I'm sure there's a lot more stuff coming at us that we're going to need to use these technologies. And if I ever get mine working right,
all of us.
I know. I've been in some meetings and it's worked just fine, and then, you know, but I think God gives us these tools for a reason, and for whatever we take out of this situation, it will be something that will enhance our worship opportunities, I believe.
I think you're right there.
Sure.
All right. Any final thoughts about our chapter 3 of Daniel?
Really interesting.
Who was the audience that this book was written to? The Jews in captivity?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So scholars kind of think that these earlier stories that we're looking at now, these folk tales, were told among the Jews who were in captivity in Babylon, kind of concurrent to the setting of the story. So people who were a part of what we've talked about, the demolishing of Jerusalem and the bringing of the people into exile in Babylon. That scholars think that these stories originated there, probably orally spoken, you know, from person to person, as a source of comfort for them to, you know, to as they started to kind of rethink where is God present and how is God present with us. And then over the course of time, you know, the stories were written down by various people. And then it's actually, we don't believe that the book of Daniel as we have it with the different chapters that we have all the way through chapter 12, we don't think that was put together until the intertestamental period, kind of right before Jesus. And the reason for that, we will get into if we make it all the way into chapters 7 through 12. But when we get into the stuff that's
the language used,
more the language is used,
Aramaic.
but then the apocalyptic section that has more and more of that, you know, from last week, we just had a tiny taste of it. But when we get into the later chapters, we're getting into the weeds with the monsters and the different images and things. And what they believe the original intention of some of those images refers to when the Greeks were the dominant force in Israel. And so when we get there, we can talk about that history and why they think that is what it's about. But if that's the case, then scholars believe that it wasn't finalized until a certain point during that period. And the reason for that is because there's so much detail describing the things that are happening. And then all of a sudden it kind of stops and there's a very vague conclusion to the story. And so they believe that that's because Daniel was finalized and written down right before those vague events happened. And so they were kind of trying to finish the story, even though they were still living within the middle of that story. And when we get there, we can talk a lot more about that. But that's kind of the history of how we think Daniel was put together.
Interesting.
Anything else?
Very interesting.
Very.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Do we have a volunteer who would pray us out of our meeting today? Any brave souls?
Oh, I will.
Thank you, Karen.
This is Karen. Lord, thank you for giving us this opportunity to study this story about Daniel and to learn every day how you are always with us and teaching us. We appreciate getting together and being together even in this circumstance. And we just praise your name and thank you for bringing us together today. Amen.
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 Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank
and
you,
I will-
Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
We'll see you again next week.
Yeah,
Chapter
thank
4.
you, Katie.